Anne, I'm assuming.
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight her right now. Go ahead and try. There she is. And spotlight. Perfect. Hello, everyone joining us.
We'll just give people a minute to connect and then we'll get started.
And so everyone joining us, you're automatically muted as you enter the room. We are going to be potentially, or we should have a period of time at the end of this meeting for questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat.
We will definitely try to get to them. Okay, I'm going to get started. Sound good, Teresa?
Yep, that should be good. And I'll go ahead and let more people in as they join.
Great. Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm Elise Nelson, President and CEO here at Vital Voices, and I'm thrilled to be joined in this conversation by Anne Applebaum. We have many fans, Anne, joining you for this conversation. She is a staff writer for The Atlantic, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, New York Times bestselling author, and her most recent book, Autocracy, Inc., which we're going to be talking about today, is truly a terrifying account of how autocracies work together to undermine democratic values in the democratic world, but also how we can defeat them. And we always like to look for those solutions. Next week, Vital Voices will be hosting Leading the Rise, Women for Rights and Democracy, which will really be a global action summit. We're going to bring together 100 women leaders from around the world in Warsaw, Poland. Each of these women, many of them joining us now, are really pushing back against the rise of autocratic regimes. Currently in the world, 72% of the population live under autocratic leaders. And that is a 48% increase over the last decade, which is astounding. As Teresa mentioned earlier, please put any questions you have in the chat, and if we have time, we will try to get to those. So, Anne, first off, you make the point in your book that in the 1990s, leaders believed that it would be democracy and democratic ideals that would spread, never imagining that actually authoritarian ideals would spread. Why do you think this is happening?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry I won't be joining you in Warsaw. I'm not there on the dates that you're meeting, and I'm joining you today from London. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. I mean, one of the things that happened in the 1990s with the democracy did spread. There was a wave of democratization, not just in Europe, but also in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere. There was the end of apartheid in South Africa. There was a change of regime in many places. There was an opening up of China and of the former Soviet world. There was a spread of ideas, and I think one of the things that happened was that it was precisely that. It was the attractiveness of democracy and the rise of democratic movements in a lot of dictatorships that created or led to what we now have, which is a backlash. We now have a network of autocracies. In my book, I focus mostly on Russia, which is a nationalist state, China, which is a communist state, North Korea, Iran, which is a theocracy, and a handful of other weaker states, to show how they, despite their ideological differences, work together with, and really the only thing they have in common is their dislike of us. I mean, their dislike of the liberal democratic world, of the ideas of rule of law, of transparency, of accountability, and of course of rights, of human rights. And they work against those things, both inside their own countries, because of course that's the language of their own opposition, as well as increasingly around the world, and in what they would see as an information war, in an economic struggle, and also in a political struggle, and a kind of struggle of ideas. And of course, we in the at least, me anyway, and those my colleagues in the Democratic world don't really see this struggle. I mean, we don't feel that it affects us, but increasingly it does. And the book is really an argument for recognizing what it is and looking for ways to fight back.
Mm. Talk to us a bit, because this was the most fascinating thing that I found in the book is actually really how these authoritarian leaders are actually working in concert. Can you talk about this incredible sort of networked web of opportunity that they create for each other?
So there are many different ways many different examples. I mean, probably the most obvious example right now is the way in which the Iranians are providing drones. The North Koreans are providing ammunition. China is exporting components for the Russian defense industry. All of these countries are really contributing to Russia's war in Ukraine. None of these countries have any argument with Ukraine, but they are willing to support Russia because they don't want to see one of their fellow autocrats lose. I mean, that's the most glaring and obvious example right now. But they cooperate in other places too. And in the book, I describe how China over the last decade has put together really quite a vast media empire. Mainstream media, broadcast media, newspapers, websites, radio in multiple languages. Plus they have content sharing agreements with newspapers and websites all over the world. They're very focused on Africa, but of course Asia, Latin America as well. And the way in which they now use that network, for example, to put out Russian propaganda. I traced the origins of one particular false story. This was the story that the Russians produced at the beginning of the war in Ukraine about how supposedly there were biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine, and somehow that was a reason for the invasion, that the US was making biological weapons. Ukraine is completely not true. It was never proven. It was widely denied. It was actually disproven at the UN itself. Nevertheless, China, the Russians started this rumor. They repeated it on, in their information network, which also includes quite a lot of sites that don't look Russian at all. They're written in other languages and they look like they're published by other people, but it was also put out by the Chinese information network. So you could see in that instance the way in which they were working together to support a false claim and a story that was designed to undermine the legitimacy, the morality of the democratic world's support for Ukraine. You can also point to economic support. You can look at, for example, the way in which a whole group of regimes united to support the Venezuelan dictatorship. One very, very weak dictator who should have fallen years ago, has driven what was the wealthiest country in South America to become the poorest. And nevertheless, it's been the subject of Russian military sales, Chinese investment. Cubans have provided secret police aid, and the Iranians, even though they have nothing in common with Venezuela historically or culturally, have also helped the Venezuelans evade sanctions around the oil industry. So, so you can see how they will team together to support one another when they perceive weakness.
Mm. So autocracy is always coupled with the rollback of women's rights. How and why do you think authoritarian leaders use misogyny as a tool to really augment their power?
So this is one of the interesting, important features of not all, but of many of the modern autocracies, is that they, as an argument for why they are legitimate, and this is of course led by Putin, but he has many imitators. As an argument for their legitimacy, they say we are restoring traditional society against the degenerate Western, liberal democratic world, which, and by degenerate they mean sexually degenerate, and we're restoring some kind of traditional order and hierarchy. And this is one, this is a part of a broader backlash against women's rights. And it does have an echo particularly in societies that are very turbulent, where there's an enormous amount of change. The appeal of something familiar and traditional does work. And of course, it works in the United States as well. And you can hear the echo of that propaganda in America and Europe equally the same. In fact, I would actually say that the order of events was more, we went the other way around. I mean, there began to be a backlash against, it's not even feminism, you know, it's against women's rights. I mean, the rights of women to be treated equally under the law, and against laws against, you know, spousal abuse. And there began to be a backlash against that in the Western world and the democratic world. And it was picked up on by some autocracies as a kind of leapt on as a way of legitimating what they do. But you're right. I mean, it's one of the features of this era. I mean, we're talking mostly about, actually, I think all entirely, I mean, unless I'm missing somebody in my head, about regimes run by men. They're run often by a single man or by a group of men, or sometimes with some token women. And they are, you know, and they describe themselves as perpetuating some kind of order and offering people some kind of safety in that sense. I mean, it seems to me the counter to that, you know, is, maybe we can talk about this some more later, is, you know, is that the liberal democratic world, and the world where we do have equality, also needs to demonstrate why we are more stable, why we also offer security and safety and rights for women, and make that a part of our appeal.
We know that authoritarian leaders, you know, sort of cribbed from the same playbook. What do you think an alternative playbook could look like, particularly centering the rights and equality of women?
So you are going to Poland, as I gather, where you know, exactly that kind of playbook has just won an election. I mean, of course, Poland wasn't a full dictatorship before last October, but it was run by an autocratic populist ruling party that was making steps in that direction, was seeking to capture the state, take over the judiciary, and use that language of traditionalism as its argument for why it should be elected. And there was the counter playbook was firstly to do with contesting everywhere. The party that's led by Donald Tusk, who's now the prime minister, you know, and Tusk himself campaigned all over the country, including in places where they're unpopular. So in rural areas in the southeast of Poland, which is historically votes for the right or for the far right. And they contest everything. They seek to be the party of everybody. And they're also, you know, they're an argument of their foremost argument was about empowering people to prepare them for the future. You know, we can't afford to be a society where some people are left behind and where some people are discriminated against. You know, that facing the many challenges that we have, whether economic or technological, you know, or demographic, requires the participation of everybody. And I think that was a part of his appeal. That was a part of the coalition that also, this is quite important in a lot of European countries, the coalition that ran as a coalition. So there was a center left, center right, and sort of center liberal component. So there was a political parties that might have disagreed with one another in the past, were unified enough to contest the idea of, as I said, autocratic populism. And that was also very important to show that the majority of the country, although they have different views about taxation rates or about, about other economic issues or other issues that might divide us, were unified on equality, unified on rights, and unified on the need to preserve democracy and preserve liberal democracy.
What other sort of examples have you seen that are working in terms of, I know you talk at the end of your book about sort of solutions, ideas, that autocracy around the world is something that can be defeated, but requires the same kind of sort of networked approach that it has used to rise. So what does that approach look like? How can women play a role in that? And why is it so important that we sort of connect across the world in order to do this?
So the book is an argument that what we're fighting, it's not a Cold War in the sense that there's one bunch of countries on one side and one bunch on the other, and there's some kind of geographic divide. There's a Berlin Wall between them. I mean, what we're fighting is autocratic behaviors, and some of them are inside democratic societies as well. And so beginning to think like that, we're thinking about how do we stop enabling kleptocracy? How do we begin to think about regulating social media, by which I don't mean censorship. I mean giving people insight into algorithms, giving them some control over what they see, controlling their own data. Beginning to look at how we re-empower people and how to how to make that argument across borders. And really, some of these things can only be done across borders. I mean, there's no point in one country outlawing shell companies or blocking access to offshore tax havens. Really, it has to be done by groups of countries. And almost all of these issues, whether it's the reform of the internet, reform of social media, whether it's reform of the financial system that has enabled kleptocracy, as I argue in the book, whether it's the fight back against a rise in misogyny. I mean, it almost can only be done. You can't do it within one country. I mean, you need these connections across borders. And, it's also true that we can learn from one another. I mean, everything that I know about kleptocracy and how it works and how it functions inside the US or the UK, as well as in Russia, really comes from the Russian opposition, who understood this first, really, before everybody else did, and began talking about it, exposing it, and so on. Almost everything I know about information war also comes from activists in places like Iran, or China. I mean, those are often the people who have the best insight into where these ideas are coming from and how they can best be fought. And so, yes, speaking to people across borders who share values and thinking about what are the, let me even say, in an era when a lot of international institutions don't function anymore, where the UN obviously now dysfunctional, many other international institutions are dysfunctional. It seems to me the new way to think about international or cooperation is exactly through, bespoke organizations designed to combat particular things. I mean, it would be almost a coalition of the willing to fight international rise of misogyny, or a coalition to fight kleptocracy. I mean, that's almost how you have to think about it now.
Wow, fascinating. You also talk about how, and we think about this a lot at Vital Voices. In fact, we just brought together a group of women leaders in Venice to have a discussion around what does that alternative playbook look like. And you make the point, and we've been talking about this idea that, like, you can't use their same tactics. You have to use a different approach. Can you talk a little bit about that approach? And you also mentioned, I think it was in Vilnius, you talk about a meeting that happened among a number of leaders for democracy from around the world coming together and talking about, sort of another option, right? That
yeah, well, there's two different things. I mean, that's the World Liberty Congress, which is a group of dissidents and democracy activists who now, almost as I just described, collaborate on particular projects. They have a focus on both educating one another about repressive tactics so that they are ready and prepared when they meet them. They have a joint project to do with political prisoners and supporting them through the legal community and so on. I think the main, there's some nuances, there's differences between what you do inside a truly repressive society like Russia or Venezuela and what you do inside an open society like the United States. I mean, I don't want to be too glib about those different fights. But I think the most important thing is to get in the democratic world is to get people to focus on real issues as opposed to emotive culture war issues that aren't necessarily real. And you can actually see this beginning to happen in the US election campaign. Instead of having a fight about, I don't know, I mean, I'm making this up, but a fight about policy on transgender, which makes people very angry, but is a small piece of a larger story. Get people to talk about something that touches them every day, like economics or healthcare. Offer people concrete solutions instead of slogans and emotion, and find ways to reach people, wherever it is that they are. I mean, there's whatever media people are reading, whatever filter bubble they're in, find some way to get to them there. I mean, I think that's another part of the story.
Hmm. And if you have time, I'd love to take one question from the chat before we let you go. I know you've got a
Sure.
full day and evening. I want to ask a question that Laura Alonso poses. And just for background, Laura is from Argentina. She is a former member of parliament. She was also her country's, I think, first anti-corruption czar. In that country. So she says, can you list a couple of usual slogans that are manufactured by Putin or Chinese propaganda against democracy that constitute the authoritarian narrative that many in the West repeat without, without knowing?
Yeah, so in the book I describe the broadest authoritarian narrative is the one I've kind of alluded to already, that autocracy is safe and stable, and whatever faults it might have. And democracy is chaotic, divided, violent, degenerate, sexually degenerate, actually, is what they often mean. And they then build other stories around that. If you stick with us, you'll be safe. If you protest, if you go to the other side, you'll create disruption and chaos. And finding ways to fight that, to show no, we're the majority. We're the people who believe in stability. We believe that rights make people safe, and not the loss of rights. I think if you can focus on that, that's a way to combat that idea. I mean, there's more of that in the book, but it's that's the first understanding what it is that they're saying, and also why it appeals to people. We underestimate the degree to which we live in an era of just unbelievably rapid, massive change. There's economic change, social change, demographic change, political change, the change in the nature of information. The way in which we perceive the world and understand the world is now totally different from what it was just a few years ago. And because of that massive change, it is true that, I don't know, the childhood somebody remembers as a child growing up in rural Poland in the 1960s, the world that they lived in is gone. I mean, it is gone. And people have this sense of loss, and they have this sense of disruption. And people who want to keep societies open need an answer for those people that isn't an autocratic answer. And I think that's just the project for all of us.
Thank you so much, Anne, for joining us. Again, her new book, which is a fascinating read, Autocracy, Inc., is out and available, and we will explore these discussions further when we gather next week in Poland. Thank you so much for kicking off the discussions for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye all. Thank you.